Greetings to you all in the mighty name of Jesus Christ. This is Evangelist Adam Amir Fazal, and today we are featuring the very first episode of our podcast, Cross and Current, which is focused on getting you to know the biblical truths. And today I would like to introduce you to our new guest, Shehroze Husham, who I've known for over a decade. He is a national debater, and we can add a lot to his achievements. He has won many debates over the years, and today he is present with us to talk on a very special topic named Is Being Toxic Relative? We all have been toxic somewhere at some point in our lives. A quick heads up, moving onwards, I would like to tell you that the video quality and maybe the sound quality in this podcast may not be as good as I really wanted it to be, and I'm thankful to you all for bearing with us as we grow. In the first segment, we're going to look at what being toxic or abusive really means, and does it always have to be black and white? Does it change with culture? So let's get into it. Welcome to the podcast, Shehroze Husham.
Thanks for having me on.
And I'm grateful for you to be on the podcast, and I'm thankful to you. And as people, the audience might have seen in the intro, they might have listened to your introduction that you are a national debater and you are also a debate winner. There are many things that we can add to your introduction, and those I believe people will have listened to in the introduction. So let's begin with the topic. So today's topic for this podcast, episode number 1, Crossing Current, is being toxic relative? We oftentimes see in our lives that we often becomes toxic. Even I myself personally might have been toxic a lot of the times. I might have called my siblings donkeys, or I might have called someone something bad in my life. But absolutely, when I repented, I stopped using such slurs. What do you think about toxicism, and what is your statement on toxicism being relative or objective?
So this is a topic near and dear to my heart because I believe that the freedom to say something is quite an important freedom to have. I think our ability to express ourselves, and particularly language, sort of serves as a window into your mind. And I think restricting that is something which oftentimes can lead to a repressed state of being where we're not able to truly embody our personalities the way we want. And I think, insofar as that's true, some amount of moral relativism is necessary to enable um, essentially allow you to have the kind of dialogue you want to be able to express yourself. So should be an amount of moral relativism when it comes to using abusive language or what we generally consider to be impolite. Um, I think if it's something which is hurting someone, that's obviously crossing a line, and that's not something which I'm willing to support. But I think there's many contexts in the modern day where we often use this language not in a violent way or a way to hurt someone, but rather just to get our point across. You can think of a classic example of you stubbing your toe and saying a cuss word. That's not necessarily you using it in a violent way to harm someone. And I think there's many contexts, especially social contexts, where this language is appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do agree with you on this to some extent. I do agree that most of the times we're not using it with the intent to either harm other people or, to psychologically manipulate their minds, or to either be, toxic. We don't have that intention most of the times. Like, for example, when someone, as you gave the example of stubbing their toe, cusses, and they probably are not hurting anyone, and they're just saying it to just randomly into the air, and that has no effect. And so we will go to the tone and impact too. But before we really do that, I would like to talk about the definition, the different definitions of abusive language. So I have my notes here, by the way. By the way, for the people that think that I'm really a kid and they think that I don't do any research, and the people that really speak against my family, the Fazal family, I want to tell you guys, you can see that I do have my notes right here, and I do prepare. I do have the Greek, all the meanings here too. So be aware of that. So I'd really like to begin with the biblical definition, since the name of the podcast is also Crossing Current. The Bible defines abusive language as any speech that is corrupt, unwholesome, destructive, rather than edifying, gracious, and truthful. We have Ephesians 4:29. Apostle Paul says, "Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but only what is helpful for building others up." So the Greek word for corrupt here is sapros, which means putrid, rotten, of bad quality. And then the word used for helpful for building, the word used here is oikodome, which means the act of building a structure, a spiritual structure. What do you think about this definition from the Bible?
I think it's a very good working definition insofar as it's likely to be helpful for your average layman whose engagement with the domain of language is likely restricted in some senses to what's acceptable within society. That is to say that if an author, this definition essentially tells us avoid bad language, avoid stuff that's corrupting, dishonest, and all that. And then it allows society or authority figures, spiritual leaders, and those sorts of people to be able to define what is corrupt and what is unhelpful. And so it gives a very clear framework for the average layman that, okay, my authorities or religious leaders have decided that this is corrupt. The Bible tells us not to use corrupt language. Therefore, I will not use this language. Now, I think this is useful, but where it fails and where I think we need to have a more nuanced discussion, perhaps, is about who and why do we decide that certain language is corrupting or taboo? Because there are multiple reasons given in the Bible, and some of these are extremely ambiguous. So, for me to say we need to define why it's corrupting, which for something like language is going to vary in many contexts. So, sure, in some cases, me using a certain word might be corrupting, but in other cases, it might actually be the most honest word for me to say. And so, because of that, I think this is a very useful but also slightly surface level definition for
Uh,
abusive language.
well, you talk about ambiguous references in the Bible about abusive language. Well, we do have certain contexts where we see the same word being used uh, in a good context. And those words in today's culture may seem to be an extremely toxic and abusive word. Like, let's talk about the word dog. I mean, this is all that is going to come in the end, but let's talk about the word dog. In the book of Revelation,
Hmm.
God says that dogs will stay out of the kingdom of God. And in our current culture, if you call someone a dog, that is normally considered to be something very disrespectful, insulting, and abusive. But in that context, if we see the Jews used to use the word dog for people that were corrupt, people that were actually unclean, that had twisted the truth. So, the Bible does talk about context as well. So as we continue forward, I would like to talk about the cultural definition. And this definition was given to me by you yourself. The definition is that these are words we consider inappropriate in formal settings, in formal situations, or either in front of our parents, like the F bomb. You won't say it in front of your parents, not you. You won't use the N word in front of your parents because you consider it to be something inappropriate in a formal setting. What do you think about this definition? And what do you think? How good is this definition?
So my intent here is to essentially be able to declare certain words as something which we can attribute to being toxic, which then allows us to discuss whether this toxicity is inherent to the words themselves or is perhaps relative to the context of the situation. And so, by using a metric which is very simple, something like formal circumstances, your parents, these are cases where vast majority of us will agree you don't want to drop the F bomb, those kinds of things. That allows us to say, okay, these are words which I'm not going to feel comfortable saying in every circumstance. Now, that gives us a definition for the kinds of words we're discussing. Now we're able to discuss, okay, are these words always going to be harmful, or is there an element of relativity involved in the usage of these words? So I think this is
Mhm.
not to use these words, but rather me trying to define what these words are that we're trying to discuss and figure out whether they're inherently bad or whether they have some value to them.
Okay, I do understand that you add context and relativity to these words. Moving on, we have the emotional impact of these words. Oftentimes words that are used either in a good manner or in a good way can have can have like an emotional impact. Like you might not have a bad intention to say so, but it might have an emotional impact on the other person. What do you think about this definition of abusive words, that emotional impact can determine something being toxic or relative?
So I think um, if we are to look at v- the usage of these words and their emotional impact, that already kind of supports the relativistic point of view. And the reason I think that is because in many social circles and in many situations, using curse words or using harsh language might actually be something which people agree with or something which people um, sort of vibe with, as uh, we would say. So, for example, in mainstream hip hop, you'll see a lot of expletives being used all the time, and this is something which people enjoy. It's something which brings out a form of catharsis. Even going back to that stubbing your toe example, there have been studies proving that using expletives and being very loud and those sorts of things literally makes you feel less pain compared to trying to hold it in because you're focusing more on that kind of thing. So I think in terms of the emotional impact of these words, it's a double-edged sword. What really matters is your intent. Do you want to point that at in a harmful way, in a violent way, or are you using this as a form of catharsis or emphasis on something you already mean to say? Because let's be real, the opposite is also true. I can still harm someone emotionally without using any curse words or any harsh language just by saying something which is really meaningful in like a negative way, right? So, for example, me saying that I don't love someone could also incur a huge amount of emotional harm uh, to them as well. And that's not necessarily me using any harsh language or cuss words to get my point across. So clearly, it goes both ways. There are ways to use non-taboo, normal words in a emotionally distressing manner, and there are also ways to use taboo words in an emotionally distressing manner. It just depends on the context of how you're using them, which is why I think this definitely leans towards a form of contextual relativism, because clearly there are instances where it is not always the case that this word is going to be unwholesome or corrupting. But what do you
Mhm.
think?
Well, I do think that this is true because the Bible also talks about this. And in fact, the next definition was heart revealing definition. In Luke 6, verse 45, it says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. The word used for heart here in Greek is cardia, which means your inner self, your consciousness, your character, which certainly means that your intention matters. You know, if you're trying to say something nice, but you're using harsh words, it certainly is relative in that sense. You're not being toxic. You don't have the intention to harm them or abuse them. But if you're using certain words with a good intention, definitely the intention matters more than the impact, I believe so. I do think that in this sense, being toxic is a lot relative. I think that the contextual relativism does come here. And so now, when we really look into what being toxic or abusive can mean in different senses, now we're going to look deep into how the tone, intent, culture, and trauma play a role on how we can interpret language. Look at what being toxic or abusive can mean in different meanings and senses. We are now going to dive into the real question. Can being toxic always be black and white? Or can it be a relative? Sometimes we give an honest feedback to a person or maybe a friend, maybe, a family members or anyone. But can it always be an honest feedback to someone, or can it be something said in truth? And how can we really avoid calling everything toxic? As even the Bible says that the love needs to be conveyed, and the truth needs to be conveyed lovefully, full of love. And even Luke 17 verse 3 says that you need to rebuke your brother if he sins. The real question comes in: what we really define as toxic language. We know what toxic language is now, and our viewers also know what toxic language is. Is being toxic always black and white, or is it relative? Can the same words feel abusive to the one person but not to another? Is this true that, the same words, like let's say the F word, and I've seen this and I've experienced this, that the same words that affect someone in a negative way can be normal to another. And I've seen this in our schools as well. The F bomb is pretty common there. And for me, it can be really something that affects me and that I feel hurt through. But if I see other people that are used to listening of the F bomb or the F word or the N word also, they might seem to take it normally. Does that mean that toxicism is relative in this sense?
I think uh, this is a really important thing you've touched on, and it comes to the core of language as a tool. Because language isn't just a way to get your meaning across, it's also a way to connect with people who are like you. And I think historically, if you look at the origins of cuss words especially, for example, the word bloody in the UK, which now isn't really considered a big deal to say, but at one point it was something which was used by lower classes and was definitely considered like an expletive. You couldn't say it in a formal context, you would be ostracized. So these are words which people use to connect. And I think this still exists in modern contexts because a lot of people do feel a sort of visceral disgust or reaction towards certain toxic language, whether that's a product of their spiritual beliefs or just the environment they're raised in. That is valid as well. And that means that on some level, they're going to have difficulty connecting with people who vibe with that language, who use it just out of a way to express themselves. And I don't think anyone, in my opinion, no one over here is fundamentally wrong. It's just about respect. If these people respect each other, they'll try to use language that both of them find mutually okay to use. But at the same time, I don't think it's okay for someone to go into another social circle and determine whether the language they use over there is good or bad based off of their own moral sensibilities.
Well, I do agree with this, that the way someone is raised, or the way someone, the environment they're raised in, or the environment they live in, can determine the way they are affected by certain words, or, if they would vibe with it. And I do agree with this. I don't know why I'm actually agreeing with you on all of this. I'm not a moral relativist, but, these are some things that are kind of true. But I do agree that, I do think that being toxic is not really relative in a sense that you can say it with the intent of not harming the other person, and it can still be relative. I do think that it can be relative only in the sense of, the context, because I'm a Christian and the Bible supports relativity in context. So, moving forward, as we've talked about the tone and intent, we're going to talk about, oversensitivity as well. What do you think about this? Are some people really oversensitive, and even if you don't have the intent to harm them, or to harm them or abuse them, they would still be hurt by certain words, thinking extremely deep inside a certain word. Let's say I tell them, let's say I just reply to someone with a very short response, and they think that this is very disrespectful of me replying in a very short way, and they think of it as, I'm disrespecting them, I'm being abusive, I'm being toxic. Do you think that oversensitivity should be a borderline to being toxic?
So I think this is one of those cases where it really isn't black and white because many people have very valid reasons to be sensitive about certain language or even tone of language. Going to the example of individuals who are triggered by mentions of SA or those sorts of things, obviously using that kind of language with them isn't appropriate. And I don't think you can say that they're just being oversensitive. But at the same time, it's about policing, right? So oftentimes this language isn't being used to harm anyone. And in those cases, I don't think there is a there I don't think there's any moral weight to it because um well, it's kind of like saying, okay, shooting a gun is bad because it can kill people. But you're saying that to a crowd of people who are shooting into a shooting range. Like, there's no one over there that's being hurt. So
Yes.
it's kind of like, live and let live. Let them have their fun or let them express themselves however they want. The real problem is when it's aimed at people, right? And that's something which I don't think you or me are going to stand for. That's not what relativism is about.
What if I'm not being toxic? What if I don't know they're oversensitive? What if I am not aware of their nature yet? What if I use certain words which are very polite, which can be, really something that is for their development, but they are really oversensitive and they feel that I'm being toxic? What if that is the case?
Again, there's obviously not going to be any clear black and white moral stance, but I think this is not a question of morals so much as it is about the way language is used. And I want the viewers to think about when was the last time you met a new person? Did you immediately greet them the same way you greet your closest friends? Did you try to do a secret handshake with them? Did you address them really informally and lean on their shoulder? Probably not. And I think that's what expression is about. When we don't know who someone is, and as we learn about that person, or if we're introduced to them in certain contexts. So, for example, if I meet someone at a dinner, I'm probably going to use a lot more polite language than if I meet them like randomly at a really wild party, for example, right? So,
Mhm.
when I'm able to understand where that person is coming from and what their moral sensibilities are, either by getting to know them or through the benefit of the context wherein I met them first, that's when I'm able to become more free around them and use taboo language or toxic language. And obviously, it's going to be about communication, about gauging the response. You don't want to do that with someone who doesn't want to hear it.
Mhm. Well, I do agree with you that in formal settings or when meeting a new person, we don't really try to do all those secret handshakes or yeah. So basically, we don't really treat them like a close friend. We're really formal and we really normal around them. We don't reveal our true self. There is a biblical reference. I would like you to comment on this. It is Proverbs 27, verse 6. It says, "Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses." The word for friend over here in the Greek lexicon is agape. It's not actually friend, it is someone who can be a friend, a kind of a friend, someone that loves you. Wounds from a lover, someone that does unconditional love, because the word agape means unconditional love, not any sort of romantic or, other love, but this is unconditional love.
Right.
What if someone that loves you genuinely uses certain words for your development or for your improvement, for your indictment? Does that really account for it to be toxic, or are those wounds really worth it?
Um, I'm going to need a more like specific example because uh, it is slightly difficult for me to think of an instance where using a cuss word is going to like make a big difference in developing someone's
I-
mindset, I guess.
I'm not really talking about cuss words right now. I'm talking about being toxic. Let's say I have a friend and he sins. Let's say he robs a store, and
Hmm.
I meet him and I have the chance to rebuke him with harsh words, and not certainly not cuss words, but something that may be, that could affect him emotionally, that could have an emotional impact on him. Would that be
Right.
considered as toxic because I'm rarely giving rules that are helpful for him.
I think there are contexts where language can be toxic when used as a rebuke, but I also think that it depends a lot on what the nature of the action was that incurred these words, right? So, in many cases, an action is simply really bad. When harsh language is used as a rebuke, or even if it's not, if it's just something which is veering into toxic territory, that's likely going to depend on two things. How the individual that's being rebuked perceives this language or this tone and register and the way you're saying these things. And secondly, the nature of the language itself, whether it's appropriate for the circumstances. So, on the first point, I think, for example, if you're talking to a spoiled child, even if they do something very, very bad, their understanding or their sort of register for appropriate language is probably very, sensitive because people haven't been very harsh to them throughout their life. They've probably been used to kind of not being rebuked very harshly. And so in those cases, you have to be a bit more careful. You can't like start cussing them out or something, even if what they did is very bad. But
Mhm.
similarly, if the action itself was really, really bad. Now, I don't need to give examples, but I want the viewers themselves to use their imagination and think of some of the worst things that someone can do. I think in those cases, it is not just appropriate, but honest and sort of it makes sense kind of to use really toxic or harsh words because if you don't draw that boundary, if you don't sort of show to that person that this is unacceptable, this is something which violates any kind of social taboos or anything like that, then you risk normalizing that behavior, letting them off the hook. So, in that case, it's kind of a balancing act between these two factors and wherever our personal sensibilities lie. Now, is it necessary to use toxicity to rebuke someone? I don't think it is in most cases, but there are probably some cases where it is much more likely to be to sort of be respected if you speak the same language as them, let's say.
Mhm. So basically, you don't really agree with Proverbs 27, verse 6.
Um, can we, just quickly have a refresher of it?
So it was basically wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. This is the reference.
Rules from a friend, right?
Wounds from a friend.
Boons from a friend. Um, so if you're in general, you can probably trust your friends more than your enemies. Um,
So we do have another biblical reference, it gives us biblical wisdom. This is from Matthew 12, chapter 12, 36 to 37. It talks about that every empty word that comes out of your mouth, you will be accountable for it on the day of judgment. So, what does this teach us? How is this benefitable? How is this profitable for someone reading this?
so I think there are some universal lessons that can be learned from this citation, and I think the main idea here is idleness of words, and this is something that kind of goes to the heart of the expression or words used as expression versus words used for a function. Because there's a very significant sort of conservative school of thought, which would be that, and this is also present in religions such as Buddhism as well, where and to some extent Islam as well, where the idea is that using words for something other than interaction where there isn't really any moral of the story or anything valuable to be learned from it would just be bad because it is a wastage of words. Now, I think everyone should reflect on how they feel about this because there is some truth to it, of course. I think in some cases, idle chatter or just saying things without really any purpose behind it can be harmful just on the basis of wasting time of taking up mental energy, which could be used in a more productive way, but also in ways where it can get misinterpreted. So even something I said in a harmless way can sometimes hurt someone if they don't understand what I meant, or maybe the word gets passed around, like Chinese whisper style, and by the third person, it's something completely different. Maybe it turns into gossip. Maybe me saying, "Oh, Adam has didn't brush his hair today." Maybe three people narrate that, and eventually someone thinks it's me saying that Adam has really bad hair, which is obviously not the case. So idle chatter can be harmful. But at the same time, I think we need to exercise some caution about what we consider to be idle. Because I don't think it's the case that words need to have some kind of real world practical usage for it to be a useful word. Think about just me expressing myself in poetry, for example. Poetry isn't going to change someone's life or give me a job or something. It's not going to be used in a practical way, but it's a very nice way for me to express how I'm feeling to other people. And I think this is not idle, this is still being used for something. Coming back to the main like sort of topic of this podcast about toxicity, I think in a majority of cases, the way this is applied to toxicity is generally when people say that, oh, there was no need for you to use a cuss word. And I think in some cases that may be true, but we also need to look at whether I said that whole sentence just for the point of saying a cuss word, which is very unlikely. Usually it's the case that cuss words are being used as an adjective or as a way to emphasize something. And so in that case, you have to look at the sentence just in the way you would look at any other sentence, whether there's anything useful about that sentence, whether it's being used as an expression. So that's the
Mhm.
wisdom I think that we can learn from this.
Um, I do understand what you're trying to say.
This last segment is kind of spicy. We're looking at these biblical references that are misinterpreted to a great extent. Critics like Richard Dawkins and Bart Ehrman claim that these references are either harsh, they use abusive language, they are toxic, they have intensely graphic language use, and are either pornographic. We need to be careful when reading these biblical verses because anyone reading them for the first time can be confused and can misinterpret them greatly. So, we consider the context, the genre, and the intent of the specific reference. Whenever we see the Bible, it is filled with metaphors and similes. So you need to be careful with what you say. And if you've ever seen anyone say that the Bible is problematic, you should not miss this out. Let's clear the air.
And so moving on to the third and final segment of this podcast, which talks about biblical references that are misinterpreted for either toxic language, pornographic language, or abusive language. The first and the top of the list is the famous Ezekiel 23. People like Richard Dawkins and even Zakir Naik, as you might have seen recently, argues about this reference to be extremely pornographic, unfit for children, and not really something that you would like to read in a formal setting, or maybe even on social media. A lot of the people would actually hesitate to recite the reference. And since we know that Jewish kids do memorize the Bible, that means that your kids do read Ezekiel 23. What do you think about it? It really talks about the sexual organs, and it also refers to the men's sexual organs as donkeys, or maybe horses'
Yeah,
sexual organs, and it also talks about semen ejaculation. What would you say about this? Even though some people argue that in the context, the harsh words are actually used to convey how the depth of the spiritual immorality of the Jews. But what do you think about such language in the Bible?
episode, right? About the idea that oftentimes the authority or the way by which we decide what words are corrupting or taboo change with time. And so it's highly possible that at in that context or at that time, this was perhaps more of a descriptive way to just talk about something. And as society has morphed and changed over time, with our modern sensibilities, we feel that this is something which is taboo and which is wrong, and we don't want kids to be exposed to it. So, in some ways, this kind of shows the development of language is quite relative in nature, because what we consider to be harsh language does seem to change over time. And so, if there was something inherent to that language, then that was harmful, then perhaps that wouldn't be the case, right? Because there are many examples of this which I can think of just in the last 100 years. In the 50s, for example, and this is quite a fun thought experiment. So the phrase straight and then the D word would literally be used just as a normal way to say someone saying something directly or being honest and blunt. So words change and the meanings we associate with them change over time. And I think this is just kind of a textbook example of that, where we now feel that this is something which isn't appropriate, but in that time it might have just been more of a descriptive thing. So that's how I feel about it. And I think it does kind of go to show my point about relativism.
Yeah, I think you're right. And even, some scholars and theologians do agree with you too. And I think you had really deep thought on this. And I really appreciate that you did not condemn this reference, because most of the people would have really, condemned this. We can see John B. Taylor in the Tyndale commentary on Ezekiel. He says that it is intended to be shocking and offensive to the reader's ears to expose the spiritual depravity of Israel. Similarly, we can see Christopher Wright in the OT Scholar. He explains that in the message of Ezekiel, that the sexual imagery is not voyeuristic. It is not something, that a person reads and can have sexual pleasure, but this is a symbolic indictment of political and religious alliances with pagan nations, since we see that the Israelis were actually having, alliances with the other pagan nations like Egypt. And that is a way to, a symbolic way to tell someone's spiritual immorality as well. Similarly, we can see Walter Brueggemann. I don't know how he pronounces his complete name, but it's Walter. In the Theology of the Old Testament, he writes, "The erotic metaphors of divine judgment reflect not lust, but the grief of a jilted covenant partner." So, do you agree? I would like to ask, do you agree with Walter on this? Because I think you do agree with John B. Taylor and Christopher, but do you agree with Walter on the part that he says that these erotic metaphors, he does say that these are erotic though, and he does say that these are, a reflection of the divine judgment of, a jilted covenant partners.
Um, hmm, I think uh, he makes a solid point about it being metaphorical and sort of judgmental in nature. I think this is definitely an instance of, we are not saying these shocking words to encourage lust or something like that, but rather the idea is to cast a shadow on, or like sort of say that this is bad, this is wrong. And the idea is sort of to show God's judgment of that, or at least that's how it reads to me. Of course, I'm not that well versed in Christian literature or anything, but this definitely doesn't seem like an instance of the Bible just being pornographic or trying to be sexually gratifying. So I wouldn't. So I do agree with the people you've mentioned
Okay.
about that.
I was researching on this for reference, and I found out that in the ancient Near Eastern cultures, the covenant unfaithfulness was often described metaphorically as adultery or prostitution. That would really support these theologians and scholarly responses, and even your response. It would support that these metaphors was used to talk about the adultery or spiritual prostitution. Moving on, we have the famous Revelation 22:15, which is considered to be abusive or cussing. Is it degrading or symbolic? Let's find out. It talks about it considered some people to be dogs. In our today's culture, if I call someone a dog, that is usually considered to be very abusive and offensive. Let's say I call a woman the B word, which is the female dog. That would be super, offensive, and maybe not offensive in some people, but offensive to some extent. God calls people dogs, and there are, absolutely apologetic and theological responses to that. We can defend this, but what do you think about calling certain people dogs with the intention of, the people do have certain characteristics that lead them to be called a dog? What do you think about this?
So I think this is in contrast to Ezekiel because in that case, I do think it was largely metaphorical and descriptive in nature. And the sort of harshness of it was a fair usage of a device rather than the Bible being like explicitly like sort of outwardly toxic in that sense, in the relative sense. But I think over here, it's a lot harder to, at least for me, to understand how this is metaphorical in nature because it is essentially an indictment of certain people and it's not using gentle language. So, in this case, it does really feel like there's just sort of an enemy and we need to use the harshest language possible for them, which kind of um, it could be considered. I think there are reasonable perspectives that will consider this to be more sort of toxic or less justifiable.
I mean, I could give you a response about, about this, an objection. You know, there are symbols like beasts, harlots, lambs, which is the Christ, and dragons for people, persons in the book of Revelation. There are a lot of these symbols, symbolic languages being used to a great extent in the book of Revelation. What do you think that if there is great symbolic language being used, do you think that calling certain people that are morally corrupt, that twist the truth, calling them dogs, is that righteous?
From my perspective, look, I think even if something is symbolic, symbols mean something, right? I can't just go to a Polish memorial wearing a swastika. Um, Clearly, if a symbol is associated with very negative things throughout the book of Revelation, then using it here is a form of being very harsh. Whether to the point of toxicity or not isn't for me to say, but it is very harsh in nature. It is quite a strong condemnation, which, if someone has read the entire book of Revelation, they may find shocking to the same extent that some people find swear words to be shocking now. So I think over there, it is fair to say that it is symbolic, but just because it's symbolic doesn't mean it's automatically like doesn't mean anything or that it doesn't have any strong meanings associated with it.
So you mean that someone that does not really believe in Christianity, from their point of view, and this could really be toxic?
So yeah, that is essentially what I mean. I think unlike Ezekiel over here, there needs to definitely be a stronger there needs to be some sort of uh, either an explanation or like a way to sort of cushion the impact of this. Because if someone does feel that toxic, if someone has a very strong opposition to toxic language and is the kind of person who doesn't even say the word clap, then they will probably find this hard to palate. And unlike Ezekiel, I don't see a very clear-cut explanation how this can just be waved away.
Uh-huh. Okay. So moving on, we have Philippians 3 verse 8. This is another very popular misinterpreted biblical reference. It talks about Apostle Paul. Apostle Paul is basically talking about self-righteousness. He's talking about legalism, about legalist people that believe in that, prefer following the law more than having faith. And then he addresses uh, the righteous lifestyle to be something that is a dung, that is waste. The famous word used here in Greek is skubelon, also called skubila. So this word is, argued by many other people like Bart Ehrman. Critics like Bart Ehrman say that this word is a cuss. This is an abusive word, and that this is like crap or even worse, maybe a cuss that was used by cults at the time. So what do you think, that is Paul using scatological language deliberately to either be scatological in this sense, or Is he being toxic? Like, like, as someone who does not believe in Christianity, what do you think about this?
So, this reminds me of um, this is, I think, a very good way to demonstrate contextual relativism. Look, for example, the B word, right? Using that, if I say that to a woman, that's extremely offensive. But
Mhm.
if a farmer says that in the context of wanting to, let's say, he's a dog breeder and he wants to get, uh, gendered dogs of that, a female gender. So that's obviously not him being toxic or being or cursing, even though he's using the same word. So this reads to me as that kind of situation. Because if you think about the context of this, it is to say that this is waste, that your piety or like your moral righteousness is wasted if you don't have piety with it, right? As I understand, that's the point of this verse. And so in that context, it makes sense to compare it to, well, excrement, because it's kind of saying that there's no point in doing all of that because it's ultimately going to be wasted. And so this seems like a situation where the author is trying to use a simile or like an analogy, and the word he ends up using is one which is somewhat loaded with other meanings as well. But it doesn't read to me as them just intentionally being provocative or intentionally trying to use the most strong language possible.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you're right on this. And, even there are some other scholars that would point out that even though this is scatological language, and even though this is harsh and somewhat graphic language, they say that in context, if you see the word skubalon, he's comparing it with the faith, because we see Apostle Paul, he was actually a Pharisee, and he used to live a life of extreme righteousness. And he's saying that if you have extreme righteousness and you have no faith, you're basically having it in waste. And, I do think that this is right. And I don't think that Paul is being hypocritical here. What do you think about it? Because we see Apostle Paul telling us not
Um,
to use harsh words, and then he uses such scatological language.
yeah, I think this is a case of context being very important in the usage of language, and this is why I feel the way I do about moral sort of black and whites when it comes to language. Language is constantly changing, evolving, not just in time, but also in space, in context, in the places we use it. And so I think this just goes to show that the same word being used in different situations does have very different connotation with it. And in my opinion, what ought to be considered corrupting or toxic really just depends on the intention, on whether it's used in a way to cause harm and to used in a violent way, or whether it's used in a less harmful way.
Okay, you mentioned harm, you mentioned violence, the intent to harm someone. The second reference is actually, it talks about harm. We see Galatians 5 verse 12, it says, I wish they would emasculate themselves. And we all know what emasculate means, and it means to castrate, to, I would not like to further explain what it means. Paul is refuting Judaizers, legalists, insisting that Gentile Christians must be circumcised to be saved. And then out of frustration, Paul uses a Greek word that means to cut off, literally to cut off, often used for castration or mutilation. What do you think? Is this hypocritical? Because in the last reference, we could see contextual meaning. He was comparing something with another thing. But in this sense, we see literal harm being wished for another person. He's wishing for them to receive harm for, violence.
I think I do think that to some extent this is at least on the surface of it, from my understanding, it does seem a little bit contrary because it is essentially wishing harm upon someone. Although I do understand its use also as a literary sort of tool because, and this becomes relevant or links back to the point I made about expression, right? This is the individual expressing their frustration. So he's likely to use strong language to try to get that point across. Now, if you think that strong language, that in this case, um, or in any case, such language of telling someone to emasculate themselves is just bad on the face of it, then that does raise some very difficult questions for why, or how you feel about this or why this was used. But from my point of view, this seems like it's being used to get a certain expression across. Um, and I do think that to some extent it is contrary for one to use this kind of language or these kinds of harsh metaphors, and on one hand also be saying that you shouldn't use anything which is harsh or sort of strong. So that's how I
Mhm.
feel about it.
Yeah, I mean, it might be really hard for me to defend Paul in Galatians 5:12, even though I believe in the Bible, and even though for me, Apostle Paul is like, the biggest apostle, the greatest apostle of all times. But still, for me, even being a Christian, it can be really hard to defend Paul in Galatians 5:12, since any apostle should probably not be promoting such violence, even if, it's for your enemy, or even it's, righteous rebuke, because Jesus really talks about not being violent. He talks about forgiving the other person. Even if he slaps you on your one cheek, you turn the other towards him. That talks about patience. It talks about being, sober. But I think that it's really hard to defend Apostle Paul in Galatians 5:12. But we can look at some apologetic responses and some scholarly commentary just for insight. Let's see what F. Bruce says. He says, "This is sarcasm of the purest kind. Paul's rhetoric is sharp, but it is born of his passionate love for the gospel of grace," which I do not think that this is a really good commentary on defending Paul. And similarly, we have N.T. Wright, who says Paul here deliberately echoes the tone of pagan cults, where self-mutilation occurred to underline the absurdity of their legalism. We have Ben Witherington III, who says this is not profanity, but prophetic sarcasm. Paul is making a rhetorical and moral point about false teachers. I don't think that any of these commentaries are really good at defending Paul, except for N.T. Wright,
Yeah,
which, accepts the point that he is using cultic language at the point.
I think it is a little bit contrived to say that, okay, uh, it's just sarcasm because clearly there is, even if it is sarcasm, there is very harsh language being used, and you can't just simply wave everything off as as like irony or something like that. Even in real world contexts, you couldn't swear in front of your boss and say, "Oh, it's just a joke." So I think in that case, uh, it's not a very great defense to just say that this is a ironic device because even then the harm of it is still there.
Yes, because even though, let's say if someone drops the F-bomb and says, "Oh, I was doing sarcasm," but he still dropped the F-bomb. He still used some harsh word. He did use something that is considered to be morally bad, that is considered to be violent. So ending the podcast with this, I am thankful for you to come to the podcast, and I'm
And
also
thanks for
thankful to.
inviting me.
Yes. And I'm thankful to all the viewers that, watch the podcast. And Shehroze, I would really love to invite you once again. And for now, to all the
Please, yeah.
viewers, yes, because you're a really great guy, on in debating as well, and such moral relativist arguments. I think it's really great to discuss such things with you for our, Christian community and for other people as well. So I really
You
have
know,
to have you.
I'm always happy and open to have some honest dialogue on this, and I'm really grateful. And I think you're doing a great thing here by platforming these sorts of discussions, because this is definitely something which helps everyone involved. So yeah, this is a great podcast, and I'd love to be on here again sometime.
Sure. And God bless you too, and God bless all of the viewers watching us, and may God be with you.
And with this, we end the very first episode of our podcast, Cross and Current. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm thankful for you to be sticking around till the end. And if you really enjoyed the convo, and if you also have friends that like real talk, you can share it with them. You can follow our podcast on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. We're with the names Adam Amir Fazal and with the names Water of Life Ministries of Pakistan International. God bless you all, and we're coming soon with newer, better topics, deep convos, and a whole lot of Jesus. Amen.